interesting, polite, firm and determined, relentless in his unwillingness to give up. He was an engineer.
A religious man, he fought for Christian values of peace, equality, and love, instilled in his mind from a young age. Furthermore, carrying these values, he went on to attend Georgia Southwestern College, Georgia Institute of Technology, the United States Naval Academy, and Union College, overcoming many a trial and tribulation and taking advantage of his educational privilege to achieve his political status and further his knowledge. He then began service in the United States Navy, married at the ripe age of 22, and fathered 4 children, learning of the necessity of leadership in his early adulthood. It was with these leadership skills that he became the 76th governor of Georgia and won the 48th quadrennial presidential election, becoming the 39th president of the United States. Moreover, standing as a guiding hand with wisdom, he called upon his aforementioned Christian values, intelligence, determination, and leadership skill in negotiating international peace talks, most notably the 1978 Camp David Summit. President James Earl Jimmy Carter Jr., engineering the path to peace. President Jimmy Carter led the peace negotiations at the 1978 Camp David Summit that resulted in the 1979 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, bringing a long-lasting era of peace and changing the process of negotiation used in Mideast conflict, taking a more hands-on yet flexible approach. Israel became an independent nation on May 14, 1948. Soon after this, in late October 1956, the Suez Canal crisis occurred. During this event, Israel invaded the Egyptian-controlled Sinai Peninsula to regain Western control of the Suez Canal and weaken Egyptian President Nasser. Furthermore, this was one of the many conflicts of the Arabian Peninsula, including the Six-Day War occurring June 5th through the 10th, 1967, and the Yom Kippur War occurring October 1973. Moreover, on March 14, 1976, Egypt terminated its treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. During the same year, on November 2nd, Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States. In the following year, on November 21, 1977, Anwar Sadat addressed the Knesset and declared that it was time to reach a peace agreement and settle the question of the Palestinian right of return ensured by United Nations Resolution T-42, as well as the Sinai conflict. Camp David. This was the first brick in that path to peace. Here, beginning September 5, 1978, President Carter joined Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in hopes of bringing a conclusion to the decades of war between their two nations. Camp David was a press-free zone where the parties could openly discuss the issues at hand. Nevertheless, Carter found early on that the decision-makers, the faces of those two nations so riddled with war, could not see eye to eye in their own personal distaste for one another.
The chemistry between Sadat and Begin, it turned out, was terrible.
In fact, after the first couple of days, Begin and Sadat never met. There was something about the personalities that just didn't work, and they drove each other kind of crazy. I think the notion that they needed to find a place where they could negotiate in privacy, where they didn't have to rush out and tell the press every 2 hours what was going on, was also a good judgment.
Carter, realizing the newfound difficulty, took responsibility, becoming key negotiator between the two.
My right eye will fall out, my left hand will fall off before I agree to the dismantling of a Jewish settlement.
The effort of our generation is to return to the 1967 borders. Afterward, the next generation will carry the responsibility.
2 men, 2 nations, 2 opposing ideals. 1 goal, peace. Begin, a stubborn man, rigid and unagreeable to many. Sadat, a friend of the President of the United States. The former sought to keep Israeli settlements in a land not rightfully Israeli, confiscated during the Six-Day War, and refusing to allow the Palestinian people a right of return to their homes in what was formerly British Palestine, modern-day Israel. The latter sought control of a land rightfully Egyptian, the Sinai Peninsula, and a state for the Palestinian people, then refugees. Neither wishing to compromise, both willing to negotiate at the hands of President Carter. And so it fell into those very hands to do something never done before, to accomplish Mideast peace with a new style of negotiations.
Camp David Conference should be renamed with the Jimmy Carter Conference.
For Begin, giving up Sinai was not such a huge decision. What he was trying to be sure of is that he wouldn't have to make major concessions on the Palestinian issue. So if he had been forced to confront those issues and had finally said no, he would have gone home and most of his supporters would have agreed with him. He was probably in the strongest position to accept the failure of Camp David.
Carter, on the other hand, could not afford to fail. He worked diligently on process papers for the framework agreement, analyzing every sentence, every word, perhaps even more so to sway Israeli Prime Minister Begin and Egyptian President Sadat, quite cleverly appealing to their values. The president spent the afternoon drafting his own wording for the Sinai Agreement. It is a remarkably well-prepared statement which the Egyptians immediately accepted. Perhaps word of this has gotten to the Israelis somehow, because Begin has requested a private meeting with the president tonight, which he has in advance described as the most important and difficult meeting of his life. In this meeting, President Carter successfully ensured that the tough-minded Egyptian Prime Minister would remain at Camp David. Carter recognized difficulty in making decisions that would determine the future peace or lack thereof of one's country. He accepted that Prime Minister Begin did not take too kindly to President Sadat and that some notions proposed by the Egyptians and the Americans alike would not be agreeable to the Israelis. Nevertheless, he pleaded with Begin, saying, "We will work not only to attain peace but to maintain peace, recognizing that it is a permanent challenge of our times." For if nothing else, the one thing that Carter and Begin both knew so well was the wish to leave this world greater for the future generations, for their grandchildren. This Begin could not deny. Sadat, too, had his doubts as to the success of the Camp David summit. He, though normally level-headed and assertive, was removed and prepared to leave Camp David, not believing in the history that he would make.
My bags are packed, and we have called for a helicopter to take us to the airport in Washington.
Does President Carter know this?
Yes, he asked to meet with me privately, but I see no reason to.
Anwar, you gave President Carter your word that you would do everything you could to bring peace. Now you are walking out. He is a man of morals and principles, and you are too. You cannot do that to him. I explained to him that his action would harm the relationship between Egypt and the United States. He would be violating his personal promise to me, and the onus for failure would be on him. I described the possible future progress of Egypt's friendships and alliances, from us to the moderate then radical Arabs, thence to the Soviet Union. In addition to his methods of persuasion, President Carter was very hands-on in the drafting process. The president is driving himself mercilessly, spending most of his time either debating with the Egyptians or the Israelis, or drafting and revising texts that are being submitted to him. He has single-handedly written the proposed document for the Sinai Formula.
So he was much more engaged than probably any previous president in the actual negotiations and the drafting and so forth. He was a stubborn man. He didn't want to give up. At one point, the Israeli defense minister passed me a note. It said something like, "Your president's amazing. He knows as much about these issues by now as we do, and it's our problem, but he knows more than we do, and he's not going to give up. He's not going to allow us to fail."
When the president worked, as far as my historic experience is concerned, I think that he worked harder than our forefathers did in Egypt building the pyramids.
Dear friend, we came to Camp David with all the goodwill and faith we possess, and we left Camp David a few minutes ago with a renewed sense of hope and inspiration. The continuation of your active role is indispensable. We need your help and the support of the American people.
It was at Camp David that President Carter offered the wholehearted support of the American people. It was at Camp David that President Carter laid the base of the framework for future negotiations. It was at Camp David that President Carter forged peace between the nations of Egypt and Israel, resulting in the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. And despite the fact that the framework for peace in the Middle East fashioned at Camp David did not ameliorate the issue of the Palestinian people, as evidenced by the 6.5 million remaining Palestinian refugees, it was on those sacred grounds that President Carter achieved the first everlasting peace agreement in the Arab-Israeli conflict, setting the stage for many to come. Today, Carter, now 90, stays faithful to his promise in continuing peace efforts around the world. President Jimmy Carter's commitment at Camp David will never be forgotten.